Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Penna Dexter.
We're going to talk about the environment today, and this comes out of the Wall Street Journal, dated August 4th. Rarely do American presidents display the raw willfulness that President Obama did. This was that Monday, which would have been August 3rd, in rolling out his plan to reorganize the economy in the name of climate change without a vote in Congress or even much public debate. Mr. Obama is using his last 18 months to dictate U.S. energy choices for the next 20 or 30 years. This abuse of power is regulation without representation. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the so-called Clean Power Plan that has certainly not been passed by any House of Congress. And it commands states to cut carbon emissions by 32% from 2005 levels by the year 2030. This final mandate is 9% steeper than the draft that the EPA, the Environmental Protective Agency, actually issued in 2014 and allowed comment on. So they've upped the ante a little bit, and we're going to talk about what this does to the economy, what it really doesn't do for the environment. And with me to do this for the whole program is Cathie Adams. Cathie is president of Texas Eagle Forum, and she's also the international issues chairman for Eagle Forum National. Of course, you know Eagle Forum is the organization started by Phyllis Schlafly. She's on the board of National Eagle Forum. She's been in politics in Texas and nationally pretty much her whole adult life. She was Republican National Committee woman for Texas. She was also chairman of the Republican Party of Texas for a time. And she was named by Campaigns and Elections magazine in August 2010 as one of the top 50 Republican influencers in Texas. I can definitely say amen to that. She's been an election judge. She's been a member of the district, state, and national resolution and platform committees, which is a very important task, and a delegate to 5 Republican national conventions. She's been observing the United Nations and going to their climate conferences for 20 years. She was an observer of major UN conferences since 1995. She loves telling about those experiences, and she's been a great resource to us here at Point of View in reporting on these conferences. Cathie, thank you for being in studio with me.
Well, what a privilege it is to be with you, Penna, and thank you so much for bringing this to the forefront, because it is an issue that will impact every man, woman, and child, our dollars and our cents in this country.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have put an article that Cathie wrote up on pointofview.net. It's our first article, so you can check that out. And we put a few things up there to help you understand this issue. But it's Obama's quest for power at American expense. And I think that's one of the main points that people need to understand at the bottom of this whole environmental agenda, because we debate about global warming, whether it's real or not, whether it's happening or not. But it's not about global warming. It's about getting control of the economy, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Absolutely. It has nothing to do with the environment and everything to do with the economy. As a matter of fact, what the goal is of these radicals is by 2050 to do away with fossil fuel use altogether. And that also includes nuclear, which does not emit any carbon dioxide, which they say is what is causing the climate to change. The fact is the climate is always changed. Ever since the beginning, it's never been static. But what we are doing as humans is certainly not causing climate change.
So the article that I've put up that Cathie wrote, and she was in Lima, Peru last December for a climate conference. That conference sets the stage for the next one. That's what they do. They build on one another. The next one's in Paris. I believe it's also in December. But she starts out this article, Greenpeace International is seeking help from President Obama during this conference. And really, Greenpeace and the other environmental groups want our country to lead the international community to a strong, legally binding climate agreement. Is that what they're hoping for in Paris, Cathie?
Absolutely. And we are guaranteed that this president will sign such an agreement that will be binding, legally binding on the United States of America. The good news is that, any treaty is supposed to be approved by 2/3 of the U.S. Senate. He probably will not even submit this to the United States Senate. And furthermore, the United States Senate would never approve of such a treaty that will devastate our economy.
But, Cathie, I just mentioned that there was a rule announced by this president, sort of an executive action. So, that's what he does. That's how he does things. He doesn't go through the elected officials. He just decrees things. So, in a sense, what about that rule? Is that binding?
Well, what he is doing is the same as what actually we've had other presidents do, using executive orders to make law. It's actually unilaterally, as the executive, usurping the authority of the legislative branch, totally messing up our Constitution and the separation of powers that was intended by our founders. Using executive orders, in 1992, Bill Clinton, as soon as he was elected, the same month he was elected, he issued what was called the President's Council on Sustainable Development through executive order. And when he did that, he implemented a soft law document called Agenda 21 in all 50 states. And now any state, any county, any local government that appeals for funding from the federal government through any of the bureaucracies has to go through the hoops of environmental extremism in order to gain the money from the federal government.
Okay, so at Lima, there was a new sort of a document written, a treaty, and it was drafted to replace the 1997 Kyoto Climate Change Treaty, which you were in Kyoto, Japan, when that was drafted.
That's right.
That was signed, but it was never ratified by the Senate.
Right.
But what happens to these treaties, even though they're not ratified by the U.S.? Do we have to still, in some sense, do they trickle down into our policies?
They do trickle down. They trickle down because whenever a state, county, or local government applies for federal funding, they attach the bureaucratic rules in order to implement these treaties, in order to implement them through bureaucracies, through fiat by the president, instead of going through the legislative process. We need a president who promises us that on day one, he will use an entire box of pens in order to repeal every executive action. And let me also add presidential statements on bills, because those are just as harmful and just as outside our Constitution.
If we had ratified the Kyoto Treaty, it would have been worse and our economy would have been devastated. And, Cathie, if we actually abide by this executive order, or whatever you want to call it, that Obama has issued, it will devastate our economy. And things like what you mentioned earlier, fossil fuels, really that industry, the oil industry, even the very, very successful natural gas industry, are at a great disadvantage. And some of the other renewable type solar, wind industries will be even more subsidized by the government. They are not profitable, and they're also not reliable. So we've got to, I think, get a hold of this before we get too far into the presidential contest, because this is not an issue that's been talked about. It wasn't talked about in the debate, and you don't have much going on back and forth with these guys.
Well, I am absolutely sold on one of these presidential candidates, and during his U.S. Senate race, he did have to address Agenda 21. I'm very excited that he understands enough about this issue and wants to learn more and wants to deal with it from a free market perspective.
Well, guess who that might be? We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
One of the challenges for us in the future will be perception. We observe the world with linear perception, but we live in exponential times. Exponential growth is very different from arithmetic growth. We live our lives in a linear way. We live day to day, week to week, month to month, but the changes taking place around us are increasing not in a linear way, but in an exponential way. Exponential growth is not something we would consider intuitive. Scott Armstrong demonstrated this when he asked a graduate class of business students the following question. If you folded a piece of paper in half 40 times, how thick would it be? Most of the students guessed it would be less than a foot. A few guessed that it would be greater than a foot and less than a mile. 2 students guessed that it would be greater than a mile but less than 2,000 miles. The correct answer is the paper would be thick enough to reach from here to the moon. This is the challenge of living in exponential times that are affecting everyone from economics to the environment. If the trend on a graph is linear, we have a fairly good grasp of what that will mean for us in the future. When the graph curves upward exponentially, we have a difficult time comprehending its impact. Another challenge is trying to integrate all the various trends, many growing exponentially. This makes it difficult to accurately predict the future. We may know the individual trends, but trying to integrate hundreds of trends into a comprehensive picture is difficult, if not impossible. That is why I believe that we need godly wisdom and biblical discernment like never before. The future is coming at us at an unprecedented speed, and we need to search the scriptures and depend upon the Lord like never before. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Prayer is a powerful weapon. From Provident Films and Affirm Films comes War Room in theaters August 28. Rated PG. More information at warroomthemovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. I am Penna Dexter. In a moment, we'll be joined by Marc Morano from Climate Depot. He's a lot of fun, and he knows a lot about this issue and is very concerned as we are. Cathie Adams is my guest. And the Institute for Energy Research did some research, and they found out that this rule by President Obama that's been issued would impose unnecessary costs, and the public will, of course, foot the bill. So if you look at the cost of electricity per megawatt hour, a nuclear plant would cost about $29.60 per megawatt hour. Hydro is $34.20, coal $38.40, natural gas $48.40. The newer natural gas plants $73.40 per megawatt hour, and wind $106.80 per megawatt hour. The other part of that, though, Cathie, is that wind and solar are not reliable, so you always have to have backup. And so you need to have some fossil fuel for backup or something that's going to work in those times when you don't have wind and you don't have the sun.
Oh, it's really funny to work this issue and talk to the men who are in the oil business. They chuckle. They say, yeah, when the wind's not blowing and those windmills are not turning, they're turned by natural gas. But then the other big issue here is that there are not even the power lines to take whatever is generated by those windmills in West Texas and other places around the country and get them to urban areas where that energy can be used. So it's a twofold fault here. And people are making it rich, not because it is a good source of energy, solar or wind, but because of government subsidies. I think it's time to call a halt to the nonsense.
We now have Marc Morano with us, and he is the publisher of the award-winning climatedepot.com, which is a global warming and eco news center. He founded it in 2009. Before that, he served for 3 years as a senior advisor and speechwriter and climate researcher for U.S. Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma. Marc, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It's good to have you. Cathie Adams is also in studio with me, and we've been talking during the first segment of the program about this sort of decree by President Obama that really would be imposed by the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Power Plan, cutting carbon emissions by 32% from 2005 levels by 2030, would basically devastate coal and oil and natural gas. So what's your take on it?
Yes, this has been in the works now for years. Actually, the groundwork for this was all the defeats of the climate bills in the U.S. Congress. In 2003, John McCain co-sponsored a bill on climate. Basically, it was basically the same type thing, trying to limit our emissions on the power sector. It failed spectacularly. 2008, they tried again. 2009. 2010, they didn't even submit it for a vote because it would have failed in the Senate. It did pass. A climate bill actually passed the House in 2009, and that was a huge moment. But here's the deal. They couldn't get this past the public. The public is more skeptical of global warming than ever. They could care the least about global warming since 1989. Global warming is the bottom of all issues and bottom of environmental issues, according to Gallup polling. So what is a president to do? He bypasses Congress, and he does it through executive order under the power by a Supreme Court ruling that says you can regulate carbon dioxide. We inhale oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide. You can regulate it as a pollutant. So humans are now classified by the U.S. Supreme Court and EPA as human pollution machines. So he's bypassed Congress, and now he's going after the power sector. You mentioned it. Coal first, then fracking, then all sorts of oil drilling. This is shutting down energy that works to mandate energy that's not ready for prime time, i.e. solar and wind. And here's the kicker. Not only will it not impact global temperature or weather, it won't even impact global CO2 level in any measurable way. And his own EPA advisor was forced to admit that under hearing, that this is a purely symbolic bill. So even if you believed Al Gore, the United Nations, and President Obama, and were worried about global warming, this bill would do nothing.
Well, Marc, this is Cathie Adams, and it was so fun being with you. Hi, in Lima, Peru last year, and looking forward, I hope to seeing you at this year's meeting in Paris, France.
Actually, yes, we're actually having a premiere of my new film, Climate Hustle. We're going to have a red carpet premiere in Paris right before President Obama's arrival. So that's our
tell
big news.
Tell us a bit about Climate Hustle, because this is the thing that the audience needs to understand about Marc Morano is that not only is he brilliant, not only does he have all of the right experience in this issue, not only going to UN meetings, but also working in the U.S. Congress and knowing the players who are implementing some of these different rules and things that don't work. But he has a wonderful sense of humor, so he's fun to listen to, and we learn at the same time. So tell us about Climate Hustle.
Well, for years we've been watching movies like Inconvenient Truth, Merchants of Doubt, and I think one called Dirty Rotten Liars or something like that by the mermaid actress whose name's failing me at the moment, Daryl Hannah. And so we decided it was time to do a skeptical documentary of global warming. And so I work for a company called Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, who does Climate Depot, my website. We are now producing, and I'm hosting it, and I wrote it. It's Climate Hustle. It'll be out this fall at your local movie theaters, at least in selected cities, and then we'll be going to television and then DVD. But basically, we got the principle of our film is we got people who are politically left, who love Al Gore, who voted for Al Gore, admit this on camera, but they were appalled by his film, and they've actually they never were a believer, if you will, in man-made global warming, or they recently became skeptics. So we feature French socialists who used to believe in global warming, who have re-examined the evidence, and are now skeptics. We feature scientists who voted for Gore and were appalled. We have them on the record. We have many scientists, including Nobel Prize-winning scientists, in this film. And we go through, and as you mentioned, the humor. We have extensive media clips. So we have everyone from every network, from CNN to CBS, ABC, all of their wacky claims. We have our scientists refuting them. we have them basically saying global warming will cause more snow, global warming will cause less snow, global warming will cause more floods, global warming will cause less droughts, less floods, more droughts. On every issue, when it comes to climate, they've sort of predicted all aspects. So whatever happens, they can say, hey, we predicted it. So we actually delve into that. We liken it to the solutions to essentially believing that man can control the weather through our SUVs and coal plants is the same as believing that witches could control the weather in the medieval ages. And we actually have a Harvard astrophysicist explaining that on camera. So
but it gets better. I mean, were you at the meeting where Christina Norman, one of our lovely friends from CFACT, was also having people put on a gas mask that was just a fake and asking the people if they would be able and willing to wear that for several hours a day in order to remove CO2 from the air? And even scientists donned this mask and agreed that, yes, this would be a good idea. And we were all laughing at them because they should have known this was a fake mask and it would not remove CO2 from the air.
Yeah, but that's part of the myth of this, is to believe that by unplugging your phone charger at night, you are fighting global warming, that you are a warrior, that you are making a difference. And that's what's so frightening about it. People actually believe you can put on a mask and do that. You know, Penn and Teller years ago had people sign a petition to ban water because they used a chemical name for water, and people actually signed the petition at this eco fair.
Yes.
People almost want to be led. They want to believe there's a doomsday, and they want to believe that we have to save ourselves in some way when it comes to this. And this is supposed to be science. It's supposed to be evidence-based, and it's supposed to be people with PhDs. And what's ended up happening is you have people who ran the United Nations, a guy named Rajendra Pachauri, who, by the way, just recently resigned under a sex harassment scandal. He actually said in his resignation letter, this is the whole head of the UN climate panel, Rajendra Pachauri, that global warming is my religion. He actually said that exact quote. And that's all you really need to know. They're treating this as a religious issue. That's why they don't need to get into evidence, and anyone who questions them, anyone who challenges them is a heretic who deserves essentially burning at the stake or any other form of torture and professional intimidation. I mean, they've tried to go after and destroy scientists' lives for not towing the line.
Marc Morano is my guest, and you can find out more by going to pointofview.net. You can click through to climatedepot.com. And Cathie and I will continue this conversation with Marc. There's something that the Wall Street Journal pointed out, and that is, this is supposed to be such a virtuous and moral goal to reduce global warming. But what if these policies are actually implemented to their fullest extent, and even if they're only partially implemented, this is going to hurt the poor disproportionately in America. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that after the break. But again, I want to send you to pointofview.net. We put up several articles. Cathie Adam's piece from last December in Lima. We've got Marc Morano's website, Climate Depot, with tons of great information and several other articles about this. You need to inform yourself about this issue, ladies and gentlemen, because there's a lot of demagoguery out there. And this is President Obama's, I think, in a sense, final important liberal push during his last 18 months in office. We need to be aware of it and oppose it. And we'll be right back.
If you've been a Christian for any length of time, no doubt you've heard about Jesus feeding thousands with a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. Jesus took something small and turned it into something big. Recently, someone here at Point of View made an interesting discovery. He did some math and figured out that according to the number of faithful listeners we have, if you and every other listener gave $5, it would help Kirby and the team bring you interviews and commentary for not 3 months, but 3 years. You heard me right. If every listener donates just $5, we'd pay what it costs to bring you this needed information for 3 years. And if you urge a friend to join you, you send 5, they send 5, well, you can imagine the impact. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Send $5. Urge a friend to join you. Support Point of View. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Penna Dexter.
And in studio with me is Cathie Adams of Texas Eagle Forum. Marc Morano is on the line with us. He's publisher of the award-winning climatedepot.com website. Tons of information there. And Marc, before the break, I just sort of previewed, we want to talk about the poor because they're used as the reason for being for all of these climate policies. As sort of this great morality that comes out of believing in global warming and doing everything you can to destroy industry to mitigate that. But really, it's the poor that are hurt by these policies, isn't it?
Yeah, in fact, it's not just the poor in the United States are hurt. You have seniors, people on fixed incomes, even minorities. We had black pastors a few years ago protest Robert Redford at his Sundance Film Festival because Redford's a huge command and control environmentalist, and he was out there supporting all these policies that would hurt minorities and seniors the most. And so what's happened is beyond domestic EPA regulations and even other policies that the Obama administration might do, the United Nations agenda is one of the most dangerous for the poor because that's basically saying that the entire globe has to start limiting their emissions. And poor countries who haven't had our industrial revolution in Africa and Asia, South America, 1.3 billion don't have running water and electricity. They're the ones that are going to be faced with this. They're going to be mandated to get solar panels on huts made of dung. And that's where the humanitarian crisis. That's why the Indian environmental minister has already been on record telling the United Nations, we will not sign any emission limiting treaty put forth by the United Nations to fight climate change because 40% of their residents don't have running water and electricity. And that is the bottom line. People at barely a subsistence level are being told by the wealthy, mostly white world, by the way, people of color are being told 1.3, 1.2 billion that they can't develop like we did. They can't make our, quote, mistakes, and that they have to be walked through this. They have to go right to wind and solar, which, by the way, solar is now 0.23% of U.S. Electricity. Wind is a little over 4%, and they want to somehow get those tiny little numbers and then have them replace coal, oil, and natural gas in the next 10, 20, 30, or 40 years. And again, everyone's for technology competing and industries competing, but you can't mandate something that's not ready yet, and that's the whole issue here. It's about centralized planning, and it's going to have huge impacts on people who don't even have a subsistence level of living.
You know, we look at the United States and how we've been able to defeat especially in the United States Senate, we've been able to defeat cap and trade and cap and tax policies. But we now have a different situation. We have a president, a White House that just sort of ignores Congress and takes things a different direction. So, Marc, what do you see happening in the next 18 months under President Obama, and what can people do?
Well, what you just said is the key here. We have, I believe, the most transformational president of U.S. since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, I think President Obama has already surpassed Lyndon Johnson in terms of transforming America. Certainly Ronald Reagan. I mean, Ronald Reagan's first term in particular, he sort of had a shift in the direction, but usually when you have a shift to smaller government, it's usually a temporary blip. And I think what President Obama has done, is whether you're talking about immigration, whether you're talking about health care, whether you're talking about climate, he has essentially, in many important aspects, bypassed the traditional role of democracy. In global warming, not only has he bypassed it with EPA regulations, in other words, Congress couldn't pass these same laws, so they decided to just do it through executive orders. Well, now they're talking about, and I mean they, meaning the Obama administration, is going to sign a UN climate treaty this December in Paris. And they're already on record as saying they don't need to have it ratified. Now, the Constitution is very clear. International treaties should be ratified by the Senate. Well, they're saying they don't need it because they found a creative, novel legal concept that it's merely an update to the existing 1992 Rio Earth Summit Treaty, which George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush president, got us into that mess, which led to the Kyoto Protocol and all these other UN treaties. So they're actually talking about an international climate treaty without Senate approval. They're talking about domestic climate regulations through the EPA without congressional approval. This is the perfect recipe to impose an agenda on us, and it all comes down to the future you asked me about. if the next president, be it Republican or Democrat, is not strong against this agenda, then global warming skeptics, for all of our battles at the United Nations, for all of our battles in Congress, for all of our battles fighting debates and providing information and winning the public opinion and shutting down cap and trade and winning the polling data, we may have lost the war simply because if the next president, say it's Hillary Clinton or any other Democrat, by the way, is more ambitious when it comes to allegedly fighting global warming, we are going to be stuck with permanent EPA regulations. We're going to be stuck essentially with industry abiding by the United Nations Climate Treaty. That kind of stuff doesn't tend to reverse itself. And if you don't believe me, how many times have we heard about getting rid of the Department of Education or Medicare being unconstitutional or getting rid of Social Security or anything else? Once these things become part of our government and become part of government policy, they're not going to be undone. Obamacare, I'm including now in that. And I think what's happened is Republicans have been so weak on this issue that unless we get a strong Republican president who is openly skeptical, is going to withdraw funding for the United Nations, stop these annual United Nations climate summits, stop sending U.S. delegations, stop rubber stamping the reports, stop accepting their premise, and reverses these EPA regulations, we're doomed. I don't see any major reversal possible in 2020. 2016 would be our tipping point, if you will, our global warming tipping point. You've heard that so many times. I think it's our political global warming tipping point.
Let's open up the phones, 800-351.
Amazed by this word transformational. And what Barack Hussein Obama promised just hours before he was sworn in was that he was going to fundamentally transform America. And Mark, you have just given a plethora of ways in which this man is doing this. But signing this treaty in December in Paris, France, we fully expect him to do. But, it was just a couple of years ago in Doha when we heard Christiana Figueres, the executive director of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, boldly state, and this is in writing as well, that she was out to reorganize, to transform, to fundamentally transform the economies of the world using this issue. So how much, if anything, do you think that climate is going to, in any way, be impacted versus the economy?
Well, and that's the whole question. If we faced a climate catastrophe and we had to rely on the EPA or the United Nations, we would all be doomed because nothing they've ever proposed would have any significant impact on temperature, accepting their scientific premises. And we know this from the EPA. They actually have a thing they call the MAGIC. The acronym is MAGIC. Their computer numbers. They don't even come out to measurable temperature differences, if you believe it. Now, the United Nations, if you follow it, the actual treaties they produce, like the Kyoto Protocol, would have no impact because people even admitted at the time you would need 50 Kyotos to actually fight global warming. In other words, they admitted it was a purely symbolic treaty when it came to climate. But that's not what they're interested in. What they're interested in is what a lady named Connie Hedegaard, she's the EU climate commissioner, she came out and said, even if we're wrong on global warming science, she said this in 2013, we're still doing the right thing by policy. And they want centralized planning, massive global governance, and that's their exact quote. You'll see it everywhere, global governance, to essentially fight global warming because they want the central planning. They want to read it. And the other key quote here is a guy named Edenhofer, a UN Climate Panel IPCC vice chair, said the goal is to redistribute wealth by climate policy. So you start seeing the big picture here. It's not about science. How do we know that? They openly admit it's not about science. It's all about the politics, central planning, global governance, putting them in charge, climate slush funds, climate, what they call this, climate $100 billion a year, starting the climate,
the Green Climate Fund.
Funds.
Right.
Yes, it goes to third world dictators. And I interviewed a South African development activist named Leon Lowe, who basically said that money will be earmarked to countries that keep their citizens in poverty the best. In other words, the leaders who are most effective at keeping their countries undeveloped and poverty-stricken with high infant mortality rates will get most of those slush funds from the United Nations because they'll be rewarded for keeping their economy. If you're a booming country with a growing class and getting running water, electricity, and capitalism, you're going to be penalized because the United Nations looks down on that because you're a planet killer. This is a perverse anti-human agenda.
Mark, I'm glad you're passionate about this. I'm also glad that we have your website as a resource. Before I let you go, just tell us just a little bit about it.
The Climate Depot essentially started as an underground newsletter when I was in the U.S. Senate. There were so many rules, regulations with the Senate of what I could not do on the website that I decided to do my own daily newsletter with my U.S. government email address. And I was able to fly under the radar. And that email newsletter became the website after I left the Senate. And it's a Climate Depot. It's basically your daily newspaper every day on global warming. And if you go there, you can also find.
We got to let you go. We're on a break, but thank you, Marc Morano. We appreciate what you do, and we'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Ladies and gentlemen, we want you to understand, as Cathie Adams and I discussed today, the Obama administration's push to, in the name of global warming, basically move our economy to a different kind of a dependence on energy, more wind, solar, renewables. And really, it's a top-down mandate that's coming from the federal government. It will raise energy prices, which is something that devastates an economy. And certainly electricity generation, yes, it does emit carbon dioxide, but they've succeeded in making that the poison and the bully for pollution in our environment, when it makes lots of common sense to try to keep things clean and to be a conservationist and to battle pollution. And certainly, Cathie, when you look at our natural gas industry, we look at the new coal plants that have been put into place all over the country. There's a lot of reduction in pollution and emissions that's just been taking place over the years, partly because of regulations and also partly because our economy has been good and we've been able to do this.
Yes.
When you devastate an economy, this type of innovation stops, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. As a matter of fact, anyone who has been around and maybe traveled to Europe during the time when there was still a Berlin Wall, for example, you could see that the western side was clean because there was regulation and there was wealth and there were jobs and people were focused on certainly sweeping their own doorstep so that they were not being trouble even for their neighbors. You look across to the eastern side and you saw poverty, you saw filth, because you remove the incentive. This is something that is just part of human nature. When you have a free market, if you want to make sure that a property is going to be cared for to the ultimate, you give people private property rights, and that is what the Communist Manifesto goes after first. They want to eliminate private property rights. That's how important it is. If you want a clean environment, you give people private property rights. And yes, a rule to live by, but not over-regulation. And so when we're looking at carbon dioxide, one of the points that Marc Morano so beautifully made is the fact that we do breathe out carbon dioxide. It is not a pollutant. As a matter of fact, when we exhale carbon dioxide, the trees and the plants, the grasses, pick that up and ingest it, and then they emit oxygen. So it is a perfect plan that God has put in place called photosynthesis. This is not a pollution. This is nothing to be afraid of. And so, yes, we are emitting more carbon dioxide, but you know what they have found in studies, and this is Robert Spencer, and I would highly suggest him as an author of several books, a former NASA, and today is overseeing the Terra satellite from the University of Alabama. He's also attended a number of UN meetings. Robert Spencer has shown that, oh, gee, golly whiz, CO2 that is being produced more than it has in times past is also escaping into the atmosphere. It is not creating any kind of a heating of the atmosphere as we are being told by the extremists.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are taking your calls at 800-351-1212. Cathie, I want to go back because we've sort of established the fact that the EPA rule that President Obama has cast down from on high will do really nothing to improve the economy and improve the environment, but it will do a lot to devastate the economy. And so you can't get this type of thing through Congress right now. That's sort of the same thing in a sense at the United Nations level, because you still do have a lot of developed countries who understand how economics works. You have China, who pollutes a lot, and they've somehow worked their way out of having to impose these types of regulations for many, many years. So you have that. So the way that these things get imposed is not through anybody voting for it. It's through something called soft power.
Soft law.
Yeah,
yes.
Soft law.
Yes.
So, and that's Agenda 21. Explain that.
It's a very interesting dynamic. When Marc Morano, rightfully brought up the fact that it was George H.W. Bush who rammed through the U.S. Senate the Climate Change Treaty in 1992. He went to Rio de Janeiro to sign it. He brought it back, rammed it through the U.S. Senate. And so it is a treaty upon which the American people are bound, unfortunately. And it has developed into this Kyoto Treaty and now the next big thing in December in Paris, France. And that is to be a legally binding treaty. Soft law, however. There were 3 major treaties that came out of that 1992 meeting in Rio de Janeiro, plus, and this is the one that has been the most dangerous to us, actually, plus a soft law document called Agenda 21. Why is it dangerous? Well, because it did not have to go before the U.S. Senate for approval. And it never would have been approved anyway. But it was really the blueprint for implementing those 3 legally binding treaties. And so when we have Agenda 21 out there that is then introduced and imposed upon the American culture through an executive order by Bill Clinton in 1993 that creates the President's Council on Sustainable Development, then any state, county, or local government that applies for any federal funding has to go through all of the bureaucratic hoops in order to implement Agenda 21. And that is how it has become so onerous. It's outside the constitutional process.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the Environmental Protection Agency, because that is the organization that we have here in this country to implement these types of things. And in a sense, they become very powerful. And this is just a piece that I read, I think it was today on Red State, talking about the EPA. And it starts out, Clint Eastwood's iconic Dirty Harry Callahan uttered one of the greatest movie lines of all time. A man's got to know his limitations. And he goes on to say, this article goes on to say, it would appear no one in Washington, D.C. has ever heard of Harry or his weighty wisdom. No one in our nation's capital seems to think they are limited in any way, not by any personal shortcomings. It's like everyone who enters the city limits thinks they magically transmogrify from Clark Kent into Superman and find no limits. And they're talking about the EPA in this particular piece. The Environmental Protection Agency is a classic example of very limited men and women behaving boundlessly. And the first thing that we could argue, Cathie, is that the EPA really shouldn't even exist.
It should not, and definitely not get so much money of taxpayer money every year. And of course, they start with a baseline and then expand the amount of money every year, which means that we're going to have and suffer under expanded regulations. And so it's a very, very sad way of doing business. But as long as we have a president who acts outside of constitutional restraint, then we are going to have this kind of abuse. We need a president who's going to stand up to these bureaucracies and, number one, say they're going to be defunded or they're going to be cut down to a constitutional size and have to fit in the constitutional size box. And I think that Ronald Reagan had the greatest of ideas when he simply said, let's do away with the U.S. Department of Education. Today, we have a national curriculum called Common Core, and that's another topic I know that you have discussed many times on this show, Penna, and I'm so grateful for that. But we have such abuses because of federal authority, because even if it's only a pittance, and that is certainly the case in Texas, only a little bit of the money that pays for education in the state of Texas, the bureaucrats in Texas are willing to go through any and every hoop in order to get that little bit of money from the federal government. That's the way it works. It's a carrot and stick, and we need to just cut them down to the size that fits within a constitutional box.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it looks like we are about to end this segment, and we will, but we're going to continue this discussion right after this.
From Provident Films and Affirm Films comes War Room. Tony and Elizabeth Jordan's marriage is turning into a battle, and their daughter is caught in the crossfire until Elizabeth meets Miss Clara.
This is my favorite place in this house. I call it my war room.
And learns that prayer is a powerful weapon. War Room. In theaters August 28th. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. More information is available at warroomthemovie.com.
Have you ever wanted to walk where Jesus walked? To stand in places where the Apostle Paul proclaimed the gospel and saw the world and people's lives changed? In May of 2016, you can do just that on a 15-day tour of Israel and Greece with Point of View's very own Kirby Anderson. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to experience the Bible and history in places God chose to begin the spread of his message of grace. Join Kirby and Point of View for Journey to Jerusalem and Journeys of Paul. Learn more by clicking on the banner at pointofview.net. You've read the Bible, here's a chance to live it. pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Penna Dexter.
Welcome back to Point of View. Cathie Adams is my guest in studio, and she is with Texas Eagle Forum. She has attended all of the United Nations climate conferences that have been taking place over the last 20 years. She's watched as different administrations have been in power, and the United States certainly is an important player there on the international stage. So this December in Paris, France, there could be a climate treaty, or at least a climate decree, coming out of the United Nations, and we're already on the way to implementing parts of that, and they'll devastate our economy if we do. I wanted to take you back to a piece from the Wall Street Journal, because I have to say the Journal is... they are on top of this issue, because the global warming sort of climate change agenda really hurts the economy, and it hurts business. And so they are able to bring some of the facts to bear. And one of their pieces is about the EPA, which we discussed in the last hour, the Environmental Protection Agency, certainly claiming a lot of power. Often their power is restricted by the courts, and then they just move ahead anyway a lot of times. But one of the areas in which they do so is with water. So if you've got a little bit of standing water on your property, you may have the EPA come in and claim... I don't know if you've heard about what happened in Durango, Colorado, but I'm going to tell you. An EPA hazmat team actually was hoping to inspect this mine that was in Durango. It was an abandoned gold rush era mine near that town, and the backhoe digging out the collapsed cave entrance breached a retaining wall there. There was a blowout. It spilled the contaminated sludge that had been accumulating for nearly a century in the mine's tunnels into a creek. That creek is a tributary of the Animas River, which flows at a rate of about 740 gallons a minute. So what we had was a plume of lead, arsenic, mercury, copper, cadmium, and other heavy metals. It turned the water. If you've seen any of the articles online, it's a disgusting shade of yellow. The sludge is so acidic, says the Journal, that it stings upon touch. Colorado, New Mexico, and the Navajo Indian Reservation have declared states of emergency as this contamination empties into Lake Powell in Utah, right in the summer season, and the San Juan River in New Mexico. The Journal says the ecological ramifications are uncertain, though the San Juan is designated as critical habitat for the Colorado pike meadow. And certainly the EPA is very concerned about all this wildlife. They have just released this disgusting water into these waterways, and certainly ruining recreational tourism, kayaking and fly fishing and things like that in that area. The utilities have to clean the water that has to be used for drinking water that's coming out of there, big time. For 24 hours, the EPA failed to warn state and local officials about this. They learned about the fiasco when they saw their river become yellow, looking like the color of curry. The EPA's initial estimate of the leakage was exposed by the U.S. Geological Service as 3 times below the real rate. The agency hasn't explained the cause of the accident. Well, they have now. And the EPA has a lot of mud on its face over this, but they haven't apologized, and this is it's disgusting. One of the presidential candidates, Ben Carson, actually flew over. He took a helicopter over this mine area and the Animas River to get a firsthand perspective of it. And he said that the public health impact is vast and large, and that, it's fostered basically a devastation on southwestern Colorado, northern New Mexico, and the Navajo Nation. Ben Carson says, you wonder if this accident had occurred at the hands of a private business or even an individual property owner, would the EPA be as forgiving as they have been of themselves? He says, I think not. So there we go, ladies and gentlemen. You can go to pointofview.com. Heard about it. But this is at the hands of the EPA. They've done more damage than they have averted in a single incident, I think, Cathie. So it's pretty it's pretty sad.
Yeah, it is sad, and I think that it is the pot calling the kettle black. I think this is so typical of bureaucracies. And again, just remember when the whole of communism was being imposed upon Eastern Europe, the devastation not only of the environment, even an accident of a nuclear disaster, but also the water, the air was absolutely unclean. And this was with the height of all government power coming upon every business, every industry, every person. And so it just shows that more government is not the answer, but giving people private property rights. If this mine was owned by private owners, you can pretty much know that they would have been taking great care not to pollute the water and the people around them that would work there, that would be beneficiaries of whatever was being produced by that mine. And so this is so typical of a government bureaucracy out of order.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was low-level seepage from this mine, but they had kept it bottled up. And then the EPA, as they tried to inspect it, then opened up the gateway to the mess. Ladies and gentlemen, you can go to pointofview.net. You can see the article, The EPA's Got to Know Its Limitations. There's a picture there of the river. Let's take a call, Cathie, from Jim in California, listening in on KYCC. Hi, Jim. Thanks for calling.
Hi. I wanted to address the previous segment about climate change.
Yes.
Wouldn't the conservative thing to do be to conserve our resources, to conserve energy and water and air? And as stewards of God's creation, isn't that what the Bible would call us to do?
How would you do it? First of all, yeah, it's a conservative thing to do, but you also have to live. You have to have businesses. You have to have an economy. You have to have energy. And yes, you conserve energy, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think the better way to clean up the environment is to make sure that the emissions are cleaner, as clean as they can possibly be. And yet, you have to keep it cheap enough for people to be able to live their lives.
Well, the EPA is proposing that the methane that's being released into the atmosphere be curtailed. And that's a saving.
Cathie, let's talk about methane.
It costs quite a bit to clean that up. But nonetheless, that...
What do you think, Jim, is the major source of methane?
I'm saying that what you have just presented on your climate change segment was very one-sided. You presented all the evidence on your side, but you did not present one iota of evidence on the opposite side.
What is the source of the...
I've been a climate skeptic for years, but I've also informed myself of both sides. And if you only present one side... So
when you say you're a climate skeptic, are you a global warming skeptic? Oh, you know what? We've got a break. Can you hang on over the break?
Sure.
Okay, this is Jim in California. He says he's a climate skeptic. I'm not sure what a climate skeptic is. I know that climate change happens, but that doesn't necessarily always mean it's bad. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, one of the challenges for us in the future will be perception. We observe the world with linear perception, but we live in exponential times. Exponential growth is very different from arithmetic growth. We live our lives in a linear way. We live day to day, week to week, month to month, but the changes taking place around us are increasing not in a linear way, but in an exponential way. Exponential growth is not something we would consider intuitive. Scott Armstrong demonstrated this when he asked a graduate class of business students the following question. If you folded a piece of paper in half 40 times, how thick would it be? Most of the students guessed it would be less than a foot. A few guessed that it would be greater than a foot and less than a mile. 2 students guessed that it would be greater than a mile but less than 2,000 miles. The correct answer is the paper would be thick enough to reach from here to the moon. This is the challenge of living in exponential times that are affecting everyone from economics to the environment. If the trend on a graph is linear, we have a fairly good grasp of what that will mean for us in the future. When the graph curves upward exponentially, we have a difficult time comprehending its impact. Another challenge is trying to integrate all the various trends, many growing exponentially. This makes it difficult to accurately predict the future. We may know the individual trends, but trying to integrate hundreds of trends into a comprehensive picture is difficult, if not impossible. That is why I believe that we need godly wisdom and biblical discernment like never before. The future is coming at us at an unprecedented speed, and we need to search the scriptures and depend upon the Lord like never before. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Prayer is a powerful weapon. From Provident Films and Affirm Films comes War Room in theaters August 28. Rated PG. More information at warroomthemovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. I'm Penna Dexter. Cathie Adams is in studio with me. We're talking about the environment and environmental regulation of the economy. Jim from California is with us on the line. He's listening in on KYCC. Jim, you said you're a climate denier. Does that mean you're a global warming denier? You don't think global warming is really happening or is really a problem?
I'm skeptical.
Okay. Skeptical.
Well,
you're a skeptic. I am too.
Yes.
I am too.
However, what if all of these scientists who say that global warming is real, what if they're right?
Well,
what are we going to do then?
Well, when we're talking about this issue, we're talking about if we implemented every one of the rules out there that man has come up with, we would be possibly affecting 0.2 of 1 degree Celsius. And so if we implemented every one of these things, devastating our economy, go back to living in tents in open fields and, drawing water out of creeks for our personal hygiene, we're not going to be making that much of an impact, but we're going to on the environment, but a huge impact on our standard of living. What is really under attack here, I think, is the standard of living.
Well, I think people could maintain the standard of living that we have and still cut down, for example, energy use by at least 1/3 without making any substantial change to their lifestyle.
I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to cut down your energy use. I mean, I'm notorious for going around and turning, the air conditioner up, the temperature up in my summer home in Texas to try to save money and things like that. But when these things come down from on high and the government makes decisions on what kind of energy we are going to use, you have real problems emanating from that. And, think about this particular rule that we're talking about, which has to do with it basically kills coal. And it's meant to pull us out of oil and natural gas and move us to renewables. And then you've got the elderly and the poor's homes who, perhaps your house is 90 degrees in the summer and you die because you cannot cool your house sufficiently. So in a sense, there has to be a balance between, as Cathie said, the standard of living, the things that we have developed in our economies, in our advanced economies, to make us live comfortably, to operate our businesses, to operate our machinery. We have to be able to do that. And as we are prosperous in doing so, we can certainly make them cleaner. And we can certainly make them use less fuel. Look at the cars, for instance. Mm-hmm. But to decree from on high these draconian laws, these draconian shifts in the economy, they're not going to do any good, number one, and they're going to devastate the economy. Cathie?
Well, I also think, Jim, that we've got to look at what gas it is now that they are targeting. And when they say it is methane gas, and we consider that that is only 9% of the gases that they are looking at, that they are saying, as a skeptic, I am as well, I join you in that, I have great concern about them saying that we are, as persons, as people on this planet, polluting the planet, and that the planet would be better off without so many of us. But the one gas that they are targeting now is methane, and they're targeting not only natural gas for having some methane in it, 9%, but also we have got to look at the largest emissions of methane actually coming from cattle. And I can tell you, after attending a number of United Nations meetings ever since 1995, but 97, I was in Kyoto, Japan, and watched this first Kyoto Protocol be written. And now all of those meetings leading up to the Paris meeting in December that is going to be focusing on a legally binding document that we can expect our president to sign to focus on methane gas is really, okay, today it is natural gas that they are focusing on, but truly the major emissions are coming from cattle. They have wanted us to stop eating meat, and that is a very big thing. And so some cities were bragging, oh yes, we're going to have every Thursday as a no meat day. And that's going to grow from Thursdays into Fridays, into weekends, and so it is changing people's standard of living all the way around. Have you seen or heard what other sources are of methane gas?
Yeah, one source of methane gas is the tundra. So right now,
oh yes, I have read that.
It's melting at a humongous rate.
Yes,
and
what are we going to do about that? And at the same time that is melting there, Jim, that we have icebergs that are growing in other places. This is a cycle, and it's caused by things that we have no control over, primarily sun activity. And so, yes, you're right about that tundra melting and producing methane gas, but we can't do anything about that. There are other places that have been warmer and now are turning cooler. That is just part of the cycle. Again, mostly caused by the sun activity, but also by winds and ocean currents.
I agree with you partially, but do you agree that CO2 is a greenhouse gas? Yes or no?
Of course it is.
Well, we've increased the concentration of CO2 by a large percentage. There used to be only about 260 parts per million.
You're correct.
And now we're pushing 400.
Well, you are correct, but also what Al Gore, when he was in as vice president of this country, wanted a satellite in order to monitor the sea levels and emissions and all of the environmental causes that were being predicted or at least on paper, even accused of causing climate change. And so that is called the Terra satellite. And the man who oversees that actually is a former NASA satellite, very much honored and respected in the science industry. And he is saying that carbon dioxide is just, yes, there is an increase, but as the Creator would have it, it is escaping into the atmosphere. It is not being captured around the Earth, and it is not causing climate change or global warming.
You know, what you just said makes me laugh, because CO2 in the atmosphere is the exact thing that we're worried about, because the CO2 in the atmosphere will cause infrared radiation radiated from the surface of the Earth back out into space to bounce back to Earth. And that's the greenhouse effect. That's what warms the Earth.
Okay,
so
we've got to let you go,
Jim. That's the
Jim.
very thing that we're concerned about.
I'm glad I'm glad that you are concerned about the cleanliness of the planet and also the effects that man might have on it. But, I think as we look at ourselves as Christians, and the point that you make is a good one, that we have an obligation to take care of the creation that God made and that He gave us. And we are caretakers of the planet in one sense, but we also have to remember and balance it with the good that has been done by certain fuels that we are able to use to make people's lives better. So, there's always science, and we have to pay attention to it, and I'm glad that you are. But also, we have to remember the number of people that have emerged from poverty because of the availability of affordable energy, and I don't think we can send ourselves back to, a place where we don't affect those people's lives in that way. I really appreciate, we don't want to be one-sided in this, but in a sense, I think we are the other side of what we hear and what's coming out of our federal government. So I appreciate your calling. I'll give you the last word. We have about a minute.
Okay. Well, my point would be that if you think that the regulations are draconian, just wait. If climate change is real, then you're going to see some real draconian things.
All right. Thanks, Jim. I appreciate your call. Climate change is real. The climate changes. We know that over history. Whether global warming is really occurring, that's the other part. And if we can, and whether we can do anything about it is another big question. And even if we did do something about the temperature of the planet, how much would that really affect the planet? Cathie, it's used very often as a tool to gain control. These environmental agendas are, right now it's global warming. It's been other things. It's even been global cooling in the past.
Yes, it has.
So I think that's the one little piece that we have to sort of help people understand. And we're going to do this with a guest who's going to join us in a moment to talk about some of the myths of global warming. We'll do that right after this. But ladies and gentlemen, at pointofview.net, there are several articles about this issue if you would like to inform yourself about it. We'd be glad for you to do so. And also the donate button is there. And we're always grateful for anything you can do to help keep this program broadcasting every single day. We'll be right back after this.
What can you get for $5? In most cases, you can't even get a value meal at a fast food restaurant. But I'll tell you one thing $5 can do. If every listener to Point of View sent just $5 this week, believe it or not, and someone here did the math, Point of View could pay the bills for the next 3 years. That's what the numbers said. $5, 3 years. That's how many of you there are and how little it takes to keep us going. The problem is, most of our listeners have never contributed. Never. To make up for those who don't, others give large gifts, hundreds, even thousands, or monthly donations of $30, $65, $100. I don't know what you can do, but I encourage you to do what you can today, even if that's $5. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send your gift to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Thank you for doing your part for Point of View. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Penna Dexter.
Cathie Adams is also in studio with me. This is what our next guest says. He writes, there is so much hyperbole surrounding the topic of global warming that it is becoming nearly impossible to distinguish among points that are true, points that might be true or false, and points that are simply false. So let's take a gentle approach, he says, in the hope that we maybe reach what the philosopher David Hume called the calm sunshine of the mind. And certainly we've established that with our last caller. We don't know all the science. We know some of the science. But a lot of things are being claimed and imposing these things on us. And with us to discuss this is Dr. William Briggs. He is a senior contributor for The Stream. He is a writer. He's also a philosopher, and he's a scientist. And he earned his PhD from Cornell University in statistics, where he is adjunct professor. Dr. Briggs, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure to be here.
We're glad to have you. And you've done a great job in this piece, What's True and What's False in Obama's latest global warming claims. I think this is what we need right here, Cathie Adams, because the first thing he said was 2014 was the hottest year on record globally. Now that right there, that's an emotional statement. Is it true?
That is an emotional statement. And Dr. Briggs, I am so glad to meet you and hope to meet you in person sometime soon. But I love the approach that you take and just saying, is this true or is this false or is this something that we need to study further? Thank you for all of your excellent work.
Is that statement true about
pleasure.
2014?
No, false.
Elaborate.
It's not only is it false, it's exceptionally false. It has been much warmer in human history. So it's only partly true if you consider a very short record and you don't take into account any inconsistencies or any uncertainties in that record, which is not a very good way of doing science. It's just not true that 2014 was the hottest.
Well,
neither were the last 14. I've forgotten how many. He said 14 of the last 15 years were the hottest.
Yes.
If you only look at records starting from the satellite record from 1979, 1980, something like this, it's very easy to say we have seen a new record. The period of time is so short that almost anything you see will be a record. But this is not the way the climate really works.
Right. But aren't there more storms? I mean, aren't we getting more and worse, more intense storms? And isn't this something that, my goodness, shouldn't we conserve in order to prevent?
No. In fact, that's another thing that he said that is false. The number of storms, the number of tornadoes, for instance, are down in number and in intensity. The number of hurricanes, tropical storms, that is, over the world are also down in number and in intensity. It's just not true. The opposite of what he said was true. And this is a strange thing. It's very easy to verify this statement. I mean, you don't have to believe me, and your listeners shouldn't. They can go and look this stuff up for themselves, look up the actual record, and find very quickly that the number of storms are lower than they used to be, say, 10, 20 years ago. Yet the president is coming out and making these claims, which the media is repeating, and many other people are repeating. They just don't care about what the truth is.
But the climate is
interests them.
But the climate is changing, and if we're causing it, shouldn't we do something?
This is true. The one thing the president said that was true, and I'm anxious to agree with him about, is that the climate is changing. Not only that, the climate has always changed. There has never been in the period of the Earth's history a point at which the climate did not change. Unfortunately for the president and for all of these activists, say something, there is no way to stop climate change. It is impossible. It's not just unlikely. It's not just that we're not spending enough money. It is actually physically impossible to stop climate change. And further, we should not be using the term climate change because the climate always does change. It's a part of the natural background phenomena of the planet Earth. So They promised us back in the 80s and early 90s global warming. This is what we should be saying. The reason they're not saying global warming is because for the past 20 years or so, a little under that, the temperature has gone up a little, it's gone down a little, it's bounced around, but it has not, on the whole, increased. This is what we were promised. We were promised large and dangerous increases. This is what the models have predicted. And these models are obviously wrong. And not only that, the discrepancy between what the models' predictions are and reality has been growing wider and wider as time goes on. Now, this proves, here's another true statement, this absolutely proves that we don't know all of the causes of climate change. We do not know all of the drivers or what are causing the temperature to change. If we did, our models would make accurate predictions. They make lousy predictions, and this is the best scientific term I could think of, lousy. Therefore, we don't know what's going on. Therefore, we could say, now you asked about conservation. Well, of course, everybody likes to not waste. I mean, no one wants to waste. We're not arguing everybody should go out and be profligate in their energy use. But that doesn't mean we're going to change much of what's going on with the temperature.
So at this point, is there any definitive answer to what or who causes the climate to change?
Now, it's every scientist I know, and I'm a scientist myself, every one of us agrees with 100 every species do. I think I said that aardvarks and radishes also influence the climate. And this is true. It's absolutely true. Every species on the planet influences the climate to some extent. The only question we have, the only scientific question we have is how much? And we don't know. If we did know, if we really did know, then the models we have built on our theories would perform well.
Right.
They don't just perform badly. They really are lousy, and they're getting worse.
Mm-hmm.
This means we don't know. We know some of the changes. We know some of the causes. I mean, you mentioned, I think I heard in an earlier segment you were talking about the sun, the
Yes.
sun's varying input. Now, this certainly has a effect on the Earth's climate, too. But even that we're not 100% certain of. We're only now beginning to understand
Yes.
what's happening. So
Yes.
we're far from a complete understanding the atmosphere as a whole.
So when the president says that carbon pollution is the biggest driver of climate change, is that a true statement?
No, it's false. First of all, it's a very bad thing to say. It assumes what it sets out to prove by calling carbon dioxide. It's wrong in many different ways. You meant carbon dioxide. I mean, carbon makes up our bodies. Carbon makes up our bones. Carbon makes up trees and plants and grass. Carbon dioxide is certainly an element of the atmosphere, a very small trace gas, and it absolutely has an effect on the climate. But how much, we're not really sure. That's the problem. The scientists assumed that it has a small effect, but then they build in all sorts of what we call feedbacks that are supposed to be these changes and causes that are supposed to be exacerbated by human activity. But this just can't be true because, again, I keep harping on this because it needs to be shouted in every corner. If we knew what was going on, our models would be good. Our models are not just bad, but lousy, proving we don't know what is happening with the atmosphere.
We are taking your calls at 800-351-1212. Dr. Briggs is our guest, Dr. William Briggs. And let's just take one before the break. Let's go to James in the state of Missouri. Hi, James. Thanks for calling in.
Hello. I'm not real smart. I'm not an educated man, but I'm kind of old, and I've seen some things. In my lifetime, I've seen people quit heating and cooking with wood and coal in their homes. And there was a lot more fires going on nationwide and worldwide before we had electricity. I'm wondering if we've not just changed our fuel consumption from one to another. I studied algebra years ago, and somewhere in algebra it said if you do something to one side, you have to do it to the other side. And so I'm figuring a balance is out here that what we burn up in coal to make electricity is equivalent to what we burned up in wood to cook and heat our homes with some 50, 75 years ago.
Yeah, we've always had to cook food. And, I think, though, and Dr. Briggs, you can correct me if I'm wrong, actually after the break, because we've got a break, and that is that we have constantly innovated, especially in developed countries, to try to make things more efficient and also cleaner. And so, it's better to be in a home now where you're cooking with electricity or gas than it is to be standing over a wood-burning stove and breathing in all the smoke. So anyway, we'll continue this discussion right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I'm Penna Dexter. Cathie Adams and I are enjoying our discussion with Stream senior contributor William Briggs. And Cathie, the idea that we would go back to primitive ways of cooking and that might make things better. In a sense, you've dealt with that at the UN level, haven't you?
Yes, we've seen this. As a matter of fact, going after methane gas is still, I think, an attack on natural gas when they're saying that you're going to have to take that methane out in order to use the natural gas, which is what is fueling our economy, is an attack on the source, which is natural gas. I have seen this emissions issue just run amok. This gentleman, James from Missouri, had an excellent point. We used to cook in our homes with coal burning or wood-burning stoves. And today, now we have natural gas, which burns so clean. But I have seen in Mexico just a few years ago a woman who had an outdoor, whatever she could find to burn, kind of barrel that she cooked on, and used natural gas only when she absolutely had to because of the cost of the natural gas. And I have seen in Africa people who are suffering from respiratory diseases because of burning and cooking not just dung from animals, but also burning within their huts. And it does cause health problems. Today, America is living at a wonderful standard of living, and we can thank natural gas, which is a clean burning fuel, for this advantage. And we should not be depriving the rest of the world of these issues that can bring them into not only not freezing in the winter, but not losing lives because of the heat in the summer, but so many areas in between.
Dr. Briggs, I want to go back to your debunking of some of the myths that this administration has been putting out there in order to get people to buy into these cuts in emissions. He said in his speech when he was basically announcing that these things were going to come down, he says that his regulations will prevent up to 3,600 premature deaths. Now, I don't know if that means in a year, in a decade, or whatever. He also said it would prevent 1,700 non-fatal heart attacks and also 90,000 asthma attacks. Also 300,000 missed work days and school days. I mean, how does he even come up with these things?
They make these numbers up. I think that's the best way to put it. 1,700, you notice, not 1,800.
I know.
Not 1,600, but exactly 1,700 heart attacks, non-fatal heart attacks we're going to prevent. What they do is they run statistical models based on guesses of what an extreme climate will do. And then they use the output of these statistical models as if they were true. So what you have, and it's very difficult to explain, is we have one set of models, the climate models, that produce the guess of the extreme climate. And then they build on top of this another model. And so we have a model of a model, and we're asked to take these models of models as reality. And we already know the climate models are bad. They're poor. They're lousy. And so there's no reason in the world to suspect that these statistical models built on top of them are going to be any good at all.
But you're so diplomatic in the way you put it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, because people are, he's not a scientist himself. He's just doing what his advisors are telling him to do. But he is a man of a certain responsibility. He does have, the onus is on him to look these things up, to ask reputable sources what's going on. He's repeating these nonsensical numbers as if they were truth, like the number of storms increasing, like climate is changing, and all these kinds of things. That the suspicion is, since he must be able to learn the truth of all these things, that he's willing to pass on these little bits of misinformation for the greater good. The ends justify the means for him. That's the only plausible explanation I can come up with. And this is, of course, ridiculous. We should not be doing this.
Right. It is ridiculous, but I can tell you one who is even worse, and his name is John Kerry, our Secretary of State, not only giving such a fact-free speech when he stood in Cuba and open relations, another unilateral, lawless act by an unconstitutional act by our president. But John Kerry has attended most every one of the climate change meetings. We know that he's going to be in Paris, France. He wouldn't miss that for anything. I mean, that man served in Vietnam, and he also speaks some French.
He's responsible for a lot more than that. He and his current wife, Hines, Kennedy, I guess her name is, they started a few years back this idea about sustainability. They started a group that led they tried to get all of the universities, the major universities in the United States, to sign on to the president's climate commitment, and most of them have. And this is the sustainability idea, because they realize sort of global warming has played out, because they have made these predictions. Most people are understanding that they've been, screaming the sky is falling for almost 30 years now, and it hasn't fallen. So they have to turn to something else. They turn to climate change because no matter, the climate is always changing, as we admitted.
You're never
Therefore,
wrong when you
anything
say
that
the climate is
happens,
changing.
That's exactly right. They can always blame that on mankind. And they're also turning to sustainability.
Yes.
Sustainability is one of these words that doesn't mean anything. What you're doing is not sustainable, they'll say.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, we need to make it sustainable. Okay, and describe exactly what you mean by sustainable. And they can't. It's a very ill-defined thing. And
I saw this.
I saw this. How powerful it is.
Right. I saw this in action. In 2002, I was at a UN meeting in Johannesburg, South Africa, and Rockefeller was heading a meeting in an air-conditioned tent. And it was so interesting because everyone in the room was asked to close their eyes and bow their heads and think about what sustainability looked like. At the end of that, people were to pour to the microphones and tell us what they saw. Well, first of all, I didn't bow my head and close my eyes. I do that for my Lord. I do not do that for sustainability and global warming or climate change. And so these people started pouring to the microphone, and they would be at all kinds of ideas that they had of what sustainability meant. And then there was a man who finally concluded, we need several books in order to expound upon sustainability. I've concluded it in one word: Marxism.
That's pretty much it. The Vatican held a conference at the Pontifical Academies of Science and Social Sciences, at which this happened 6 weeks ago or so. They invited all of these mayors and other world leaders, like Bill de Blasio, the socialist mayor of New York, Governor Jerry Brown from California, all these sort of far-left leaders. And their purpose of this thing was to come up with a document, talk about climate change and sustainability. And this document said, well, what do we have to do? We have to embrace the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So what are these?
Well, you know what? I've got to jump in, Dr. Briggs, because we're about to end the program. We've got one with us here in the studio who's been to most of the UN conferences, and I think this is a topic that we'll have to take up again. So thanks for joining us. We will definitely have you back.
My pleasure.
Thanks for exposing the myths.
Thanks for having me.
Cathie, before we say goodbye to everyone, and first of all, I want to thank you, Andrew, and also Catherine and Chris for all of your work behind the scenes. And Cathie, thank you for being here. But, you know, if we go to the Word of God and we look in the Psalms, we see the one who actually is responsible for climate change. It's God. He created the earth. He created the heavens, and he's the one that makes the storms, and he's the one that brings the rain, and he's the one that causes the sun to shine.
That's right.
So we can thank him for that. And I think the emperor has new clothes with regard to the way people think that human beings are responsible for this. But thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. It was a thrill for me, and God bless you, Penna, and your listeners. And we can trust a God who is on his throne. He is not fretting. He is seated. He is in sovereign control.
Have a great night. We'll see you tomorrow.
From Provident Films and Affirm Films comes War Room. Tony and Elizabeth Jordan's marriage is turning into a battle, and their daughter is caught in the crossfire until Elizabeth meets Miss Clara.
This is my favorite place in this house. I call it my war room.
And learns that prayer is a powerful weapon. War Room. In theaters August 28th. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. More information is available at warroomthemovie.com.
Have you ever wanted to walk where Jesus walked? To stand in places where the Apostle Paul proclaimed the gospel and saw the world and people's lives changed? In May of 2016, you can do just that on a 15-day tour of Israel and Greece with Point of View's very own Kirby Anderson. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to experience the Bible and history in places God chose to begin the spread of his message of grace. Join Kirby and Point of View for Journey to Jerusalem and Journeys of Paul. Learn more by clicking on the banner at pointofview.net. You've read the Bible. Here's a chance to live it. pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.